Good afternoon. I am Carol Allman Morton, the Executive Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. If you'd like to learn more about programming at OLLI at BCC, you can check out our website, and I'm going to put that link in the chat. And we have a couple of distinguished speaker series lectures coming up on Zoom. The first is Dr. Mary Clark. That's going to be on exploring the culture of Spain, Wednesday, March 27th at 7 p.m. And I will put a link to her lecture in the chat. And Dr. Robert Gruber is giving a lecture on the ethics of collective action on Tuesday, April 11th at 7 p.m. And here is a link to that. And then last but definitely not least, our spring courses are now open for registration. And you can learn more. You can see the descriptions and sign up at berkshireolli.org/spring23. All right, let's get rolling. I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Irv Lubliner, who teaches math, blues harmonica, and Lubliner. I got nervous and I said it too fast. Irv teaches math, blues harmonica, and literature classes for the OLLI program at Southern Oregon University, SOU. An emeritus Southern Oregon University professor specializing in mathematics education. He taught for 40 years at all levels, kindergarten through graduate school, led seminars for teachers in 39 states, and gave over 350 conference presentations, including several keynote addresses. In 2019, he created Falabra Press and published his mother's writings about her experiences during the Holocaust, the book that will serve as the theme for this presentation. And Irv let us know before the session that he's given this talk to 90 different lifelong learning institutes. Was that right?
Well, 90 times for about 66 different OLLIs.
Oh my goodness. Well, anyway, we are delighted that you're here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Very good. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm appreciative of all of the people who have carved out this time to spend with me to hear words that my mother wanted to share with me, but also share with you. So thank you for being here, everybody. This presentation is one that I gave for my own OLLI program at Southern Oregon University, where I do teach a 4-week class about the book that I published. But for people who didn't want a full 4 weeks on the book, I did a single session that led to a suggestion, why don't I offer this to other OLLIs around the country? And as I said, I've now done it for, I think, 66 or 67 different OLLIs. I'm delighted to be presenting to yours today. I'm going to share my screen now and show you some PowerPoint slides to introduce you to my mother and give you a sense of how it came to be that I published her stories. I share from my iPad that's sitting next to my computer, so it takes a few seconds to convert over to it. Hopefully you're now seeing that slide. If you have a portion of your screen blocked with my image and perhaps other little windows, you can probably minimize that so it takes up less of your screen, or perhaps none at all. The book that I published is called Only Hope, A Survivor's Stories of the Holocaust. And I subtitled this presentation, My Mother and the Holocaust Brought to Light. You see at the bottom my affiliation with Southern Oregon University. And only upon my retirement did I move in this direction of doing Holocaust education. I published my mother's writings. I created a publishing company called Falabra Press. And there in the bottom right corner, you see the URL for the book, the book's website. There you can see recorded presentations, much like the one I'm giving today, in case you have friends or family members you think would appreciate seeing such a presentation. There are some recorded presentations that are much shorter, I think as short as 5 or 10 minutes, and then some are lengthy, like this one is going to be. Hopefully you won't find it to be too lengthy. There's also recorded interviews, audio of interviews. I was interviewed twice for our local NPR radio station. So if you seek more information about my mother's experience and my own experience as the child of 2 Holocaust survivors, I invite you to visit onlyhopebook.com. And one last comment about that website, there's a link there that you can use to contact me if you have suggestions, resources to share, comments about today's presentation, or for any reason you wish to contact me, you can do so through the website. This is my mother's family, the Bornstein family. My mother grew up in a little town in the center of Poland called Pabianice, and she's a member of a large family. Now, unfortunately, every member of the family was murdered with one exception, and that was my mother. All the others were murdered during the Holocaust, which means I did not get a chance to meet my grandparents. I didn't meet my great-grandmother who lived with the family, and everybody else you see in this photograph would have been an uncle or an aunt to me if they had lived, a brother or sister to my mother. I think it's safe to say that my mother's at least 16 in this photograph because she looks like she's at least that old, but she can't be older than 17 because when she was 17, her father was taken away, two of her sisters were taken away and never seen again. So the fact that the family is still together helps me give an approximate time for this. I think my mother's an old 16 or a young 17. If you arrived at a concentration camp like Auschwitz, which both my parents did through Auschwitz, you'd be told, leave your photographs here, leave your prized possessions here, you'll be getting them back shortly. And then you never saw those possessions again. So the only way this photograph is in my possession is that it was mailed out of Poland prior to the Holocaust to my mother's aunt who lived in Oakland, California. Years later, I was born in Oakland, California. And so this aunt passed on this picture to me. It is the only picture I have of my mother as in her youth. Britannica.com defines the word Holocaust as the systematic state-sponsored killing of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and millions of others by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II. Now, my mother tells her stories from the perspective of a Jew growing up in Poland, but I want to acknowledge some of those other groups that were also persecuted and in many cases killed. They included people with disabilities. The Nazis had as a goal to create a civilization free of disabilities, free of people of color, free of people of certain religious groups. And so if you had a disability, you were at a tremendous disadvantage because many viewed you as not worth wasting resources on. Why give food to people with disabilities? They might reproduce and have other children, offspring who have disabilities. We don't want that. And so people with disabilities were at a tremendous disadvantage, as were the Roma and Sinti people, sometimes referred to as gypsies. Political opponents of the Nazi regime, if you spoke out against what the Nazis were doing, it was very likely you would be imprisoned for that. Jehovah's Witnesses were another religious group that were persecuted. Homosexuals, people of color or mixed race, the Freemasons, and anyone who tried to protect others who were being subjected to persecution. The Nazis employed a punishment system that called for the punishment of many for the actions of one. So if you took the risk of protecting somebody who was being persecuted, maybe you were willing to hide somebody in your basement or in your attic, if you were caught, you would be punished and perhaps killed. You might be brought to the town square and publicly hung to make an example out of you. And then the people you had hidden would also be publicly hung to make an example out of them. But it wouldn't stop there because they would then come after your family members, your friends. They might even take strangers in your neighborhood and just say, we're going to punish or kill 50 people for the actions of this one person. And this was just a way that they dissuaded people from getting out of line. They just wanted people to conform to what was expected. And when you knew the punishments were going to be that severe, you tended to comply. My mother tells her stories from the perspective of a Jew growing up in Poland. And things became difficult for all the Poles because the Germans were an invading force, but especially for the Jews. The propaganda at the time was telling people, if you think your life is rough and you need a scapegoat, take it out on the Jews. You'll see them on the street. They're forced to wear this yellow star distinguishing them. And these are beings that you need not treat like human beings. Treat them like animals. They're not allowed to walk on the sidewalk. They're only allowed to walk in the gutter. That's where they belong. If you want to beat them, rob them, break into where they live, feel free to do that. There will be no punishments. In fact, we encourage you to mistreat these people. And among the things that Jews endured were random attacks. They were barred from a variety of professions. They were expelled from public schools, whether they were teachers, administrators, or students. Schooling for them just ground to a halt. They were banned from parks, restaurants, swimming pools, and the like. They were not allowed freedom of movement. This meant you could not drive or own a car. You could not drive or own a bicycle. You could not use public transit. You could not ride the trains. So if you wanted to get from point A to point B, you had to really do it on foot. And if you had things you needed to carry from point A to point B, you just had to carry them. Movement became very, very difficult. They were evicted from their homes without reason or notice. They were forced to forfeit radios, telephones, fur coats, and the like. Now, your radio was the way you kept track of what was going on in the world. And some people were not willing to forfeit their radios. They would listen to them at very, very low volume late at night in hopes of not being caught. But if you were caught, this would be one of those situations where you were going to suffer greatly. People near you were going to suffer greatly. Even strangers around you might suffer for your supposed misdeed of holding onto your radio. So it was at a tremendous risk to hold on to such a thing. There was no protection in courts of law. People were subjected to strict curfews. They were banned from shopping in stores owned by non-Jews. And if you went to a store owned by a fellow Jew, it was likely that the storekeeper would tell you, I would sell you things if I could get them, but nobody's willing to sell them to me anymore. So I'm going out of business. You'll have to do what I'm about to do, and that is turn to the black market for the things you need. Of course, the prices will be exorbitant, and many people were selling off their jewelry, their dishes, their cookware, their prized possessions just to make ends meet. They were forced to append either Sarah or Israel to their names on documents, kind of like a middle name. And this way, if you were presenting a document to the government, but you weren't presenting it in person, so they wouldn't see your yellow star, they would see this designation, Sarah or Israel, and they would realize this request is coming from a Jew. We generally turn down such requests, and that's what we're likely to do in this case. There were tremendous penalties if you didn't comply and include Sarah or Israel on your documents. And this is a partial list. It really goes on from there. And people have to wonder, can this get any worse? And unfortunately, it does get much worse. My mother grew up in this little town called Pabianice. My father was in the nearby town of Lodz, or as it's pronounced in Polish, the capital L would have a slash through it and would be pronounced Łódź. They were neighbors. They didn't know each other, but they grew up very close together. Between 1933 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its allies established more than 44,000 camps and other incarceration sites, including the ghettos. Now, in the context of today's youth culture, the word ghetto might just be used to refer to somebody's clothing. Oh, the way you're dressed is so ghetto. Or they might use the word ghetto to refer to the poor part of town. But in the context of the Holocaust, ghetto means you're most likely behind barbed wire. You're living in a dwelling designed for one family, and unfortunately, there are many families living in it. So you don't have your own room. Even your family might not have its own room. So you might be sharing that small space with another family. People are sleeping on the floor. You may or may not have running water. You may or may not have electricity. You certainly don't have the things you need for your daily comfort. The more I read about the ghettos, the more I realize just how bad a life that was. Eventually, they closed the Pabianice ghetto and moved nearly everybody there to the Łódź ghetto. So my parents were in the same ghetto at the same time. I found this photograph of people being marched out of the Pabianice ghetto. They're going to a train station where they will take the short train ride to the Łódź ghetto. You'll notice that nobody has a cart to carry their belongings. Nobody has an actual suitcase to carry their belongings. They basically are just carrying what they possess, what's most valuable to them. They just have to carry it from place to place. I am 99% sure that that's my mother. And I've shared this picture with people who knew my mother years ago before she passed, and they go, yep, that's your mom. She's partially hidden here, but we're pretty sure that's her. And I do think some of the people surrounding her are some of the sisters and a brother that we saw in that earlier photo, especially that man to the right of that yellow arrow who looks like he's looking off to his right. I think that's a brother we saw in that earlier photograph. People were sent from the Lodz ghetto elsewhere. They always maintained a work crew, a sizable work crew, to man the many factories that existed within the Lodz ghetto where goods were being produced that would be useful to the German army or the German people. But eventually, my parents were sent from the Lodz ghetto to Auschwitz. They were still unknown to each other. They were sent to Auschwitz in separate transports on different days. But again, they're in the same place at the same time, not knowing each other. Now, Auschwitz is by far the most well-known of all the concentration camps. And I want to say a few words about why. There were some camps that served no purpose but to exterminate people. And if you were sent to one of these camps, it was very likely you would get off a train, you'd be pushed into a truck, like a moving van. That van would take 100 or even more people out to the countryside. All the people would be taken out of the van, lined up around a huge pit. Somebody would go down the line shooting each person. Bodies would fall into the pit, and those who happened to survive the gunshot would just be buried alive by the next group of people that would fall into the pit, on top of them, just eventually filling the pit with dead bodies. Eventually, they armed is the wrong word, they equipped the trucks with special tubing to bring the exhaust fumes into where all the people were being transported. So people were asphyxiated, and then they would just take the trucks out to the countryside, unload them into the pit. There was no longer a need to shoot people. So if you were sent to one of these camps, you were very unlikely to survive it. And the people who worked at these camps didn't want to talk about it. So there are bits and pieces of information known about these camps, but very, very little. Now, Auschwitz was a much larger camp that served multiple purposes, not just extermination. It was an extermination camp for 1.1 million people who were killed, and many of them were killed within minutes of their arrival. They would go through a selection process where somebody would look at them. They're already malnourished from their experience at whatever ghetto they had come from. And so they would look at them and decide, this person looks worthy of doing slave labor. This person looks like they won't last long doing it. Let's just kill them now. And so many people were killed within minutes of arrival. They would see a sign that says Arbeit macht frei, which means work sets you free. And this was just a deception intended to keep people calm. They would see the sign, they would hear a band playing in the background, and they would think, well, this isn't ideal. We are prisoners, but they're going to put us to work. And that's a good sign, because if they're going to put us to work, they're going to feed us, and they're going to clothe us, and they're going to house us. But for many, that sign was one of the last things they ever saw. 85% of those sent to Auschwitz died there, either as part of that initial trip to the gas chamber, or they died from a variety of other causes. They could be just the malicious behavior of a guard who doesn't like what you're doing and shoots you because of it. It could be disease. It could be freezing to death. There are many, many ways that you could lose your life at Auschwitz. If you weren't part of that initial selection sent to the gas chambers, then from that moment on, you had a life expectancy of about 2 months. And that's how harsh the conditions were at Auschwitz. That's a detail I learned by taking a virtual tour of Auschwitz about 6 months ago. It's a wonderful tour led online by somebody who's actually there in Poland, in the town where Auschwitz was located. I felt the tour was so good, I've signed up to do it again next month. So that's where I learned you have a life expectancy of 2 months if you're not killed immediately. For some, it was a place to do slave labor, either inside the camp or for companies outside the walls of the camp. Of course, people were not paid for that labor. They would just get a tiny bit to eat to sustain them till the next day, and that was it. For some, it was just a place to wait and be sent somewhere else. My parents were ultimately sent to other camps, my mother to a camp called Gross-Rosen, and my father to Germany to a camp called Bergen-Belsen, sometimes referred to as just Belsen. Most of what I am going to share with you today is about my mother's experience because she was outspoken. She wrote about her experience. She spoke publicly about her experience. My father was mum on the subject, did not want to get into it. But I want to acknowledge what he went through at Bergen-Belsen for a moment. When the British arrived to liberate Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945, they found 10,000 unburied dead bodies. It's hard to imagine just coming upon 10,000 bodies. And then there were another 13,000 barely clinging to life that they could not bring back. There was another 13,000 died in the weeks and months that followed. When my father was liberated, he weighed 100 pounds less than I do right now. I weigh about 180. My father, when he was freed, weighed 80. He needed a lot of support. He needed several surgeries because his digestive tract had pretty much shut down, had forgotten how to process food. And for many of the 13,000 who died, that was the issue, that their digestive tracts just no longer worked. Richard Dimbleby of the BBC accompanied the British soldiers coming into Belsen, and he wrote, "Here, over an acre of ground, lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful, ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people with nothing to do and with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life." And when the soldiers encountered 10,000 dead bodies, they could not give each of those people an individual burial. So this was the way those people were buried. And when I look at a photograph like this, or when I read my mother's writings, I'm reminded of the fact that each of these was an individual, deserves to be remembered as an individual with dreams and ambitions and family members and hobbies and such. And it's a shame that we have to have a burial like this. But unfortunately, there are places in the world right now where people are being subjected to mass burial. It's very sad. As I said, you'd arrive at Auschwitz and see this sign, Arbeit macht frei, just a grand deception. Work did not set you free. My mother describes many things in Auschwitz happening in groups of 5, including sleeping. I couldn't find a photograph of 5 women sleeping in a bunk, but I did find this one with 3 women sharing a bunk. Now, whether it's 3 or 4 or 5, imagine the discomfort. If you have a blanket at all, it's one blanket to share among your group. If you have anything underneath you, it's just wooden slats, and maybe you gather some hay outside or something and put it down there. But then again, that hay might be wet, it might be infested with lice, and you might not want it anywhere near you. If one person in your group needs to move to scratch an itch, then everybody's got to move to accommodate that. If one person in the barracks gets a disease, it's likely that everybody in the barracks is going to get a disease. It's freezing cold at night, and you're just doing whatever you can to survive another night. Before sunrise, somebody comes through and tells you, get outside, get outside. And you go outside, and you kneel or stand in the mud for hours while they count thousands of people, and you're in groups of 5. And the dead bodies, if people died overnight, their bodies are brought out, and they too are put in groups of 5. And people are counted 5, 10, 15, 20. And if the count is off by even 1, then the guards suspect somebody's not showing up for roll call. Somebody might be trying to escape. So all of you just stand here or kneel here. We're going to do our count over again. It's going to be several hours. And we just need to know if our count is exact, because otherwise we need to start looking for an escapee. So again, many people being punished for the actions of one who didn't show up for roll call. My mother describes feeding as happening in groups of 5. So they would hand your group of 5 a tiny loaf of bread. You have no utensils with which to cut it. So by hand, you're doing your best to break it into 5 equal pieces. They would hand you a pail of watery, sandy soup, and you would decide, okay, we're each going to take 5 gulps. And so you would just put the pail to your lips, and you take 5 gulps, and you pass it to the next woman who takes her 5 gulps. And as you're taking your gulps, the other 4 people are watching you intently to make sure you don't cheat and take a 6th gulp. So everybody needed every drop of that soup because whatever nourishment they could get from it, they really needed. Somehow my mother survives more than 2 months in Auschwitz, and she survives her time in Gross-Rosen. And this is a photograph of my mother about 7 months after her liberation. Now, I say it's a photograph, but it's actually one frame from an Academy Award-winning documentary narrated by Morgan Freeman called The Long Way Home. It won the Best Documentary Award in 1997. It documents what happened to people liberated from the concentration camps who no longer had homes to return to. In many cases, their homes were now occupied by others who did not want to give up their new dwelling. And so you were not welcomed if you returned to your community. So refugee camps were established in 1945, and those refugee camps were still in existence well into the late 50s because it was a slow process finding new locations for people to live. The US had set quotas and would take a certain number in. China had a certain quota and would take a certain number in. Palestine, there was not yet an Israel, but Palestine took a certain number in. And so it was a waiting game, and people would hope that some country would allow them to come. About 10 minutes before the end of this movie, for 2 seconds, my mother is on the screen. And in those 2 seconds, she blinks. So I realized this was movie footage of my mother. So I contacted the filmmaker and I said, can I get the rest of this footage? And he wrote back to me a very nice email, and it said, we wanted to include your mother in our movie because of her eyes. We felt her eyes expressed the grief of the past, but her hope for the future. And we only had 1 second of footage, which we show in slow motion so that it would last 2 seconds on the screen. And we don't have any more footage for you. But I'm so pleased to own a copy of The Long Way Home so I can watch my mother blink for those 2 seconds. It's just very, very meaningful for me to have this movie footage of her. My mother lost all 8 of her siblings and her parents and her grandmother. My father lost his parents, and he had an older brother who survived and survived in much better health than my father was. Once I come on the scene, I come to know him as my Uncle David. David lost his wife, lost his daughter in the Holocaust, but he made inquiries to find that his brother was still alive and being recuperating in a hospital. So he traveled to where my father was, and he presented himself and said, I'm here to see my brother, Irv Lubliner. And the woman who greeted him said, well, he's sitting right there. And my uncle said, that's not my brother. And she said, well, you should go talk to him because he does respond to the name Irv Lubliner. So my uncle approached my dad. The two of them did not recognize each other. And only when they started to chat did they realize that their memories were the same. They had the same parents. And my father had found his brother. My uncle was engaged to remarry. And when his fiance met my father, she said to him, I know a woman from my little village of Pabianica. I think you'd enjoy meeting her. So she played matchmaker and brought my parents together. So my father and his brother both married women from this little town of Pabianica. These are my parents and my older brother, Joseph, coming over from Europe to the US. My mother made contact with her aunt in Oakland, California. That aunt said, if you can get a visa to come to the US, do that. I'll help you make a new start. So they got off the boat in New Orleans, perhaps with a train ticket that my mother's aunt had provided. They made their way to Oakland, California, and I was born 3 years later in Oakland. My mother unfortunately died in 1974. My father was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's almost immediately after that and died 6 years later. And my older brother died in 1982 of an aortic aneurysm. So I miss all 3 of these people so much and wish that they were here to tell you their story themselves and to correct any inaccuracies in my own memory. but I'll just do the best I can to share my recollections with you. My parents were determined that Joseph and I would have the most normal American kid upbringing that they could provide to us. We did attend Hebrew school. We went once a week for Hebrew instruction in preparation for our bar mitzvahs. We were members of a conservative synagogue in Oakland, California, but they did not want Joseph and me to think of ourselves as Europeans. They wanted us to think of ourselves as Americans. They would switch into Yiddish or Polish when they didn't want us to understand, but conversations typically were in English in our household. My mother wanted to practice her English. She wanted to master the language. She wanted to think of herself as a new American. Our upbringing included things like Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, athletics at school, activities at the recreation department. They wanted us to think of ourselves as American children. And that meant we weren't talking about the Holocaust. If I had questions, they would respond to them, but with very short clipped answers. So if I said, why don't I have grandparents? They would explain, your grandparents died during the war. And if I said, why do you both have tattooed numbers on your arm? They would explain, well, we were prisoners during the war and our captors tattooed us. And I sensed that every time I would ask such a question, there was a lot of grief and anxiety associated with them answering me. So my tendency was to just stop asking, and I learned so little. I saw my parents light memorial candles every year for their lost loved ones, but the prayers said were in Hebrew, and the people were not being mentioned individually by name. So I learned very little about my grandparents, my uncles and aunts. I had some awareness of the fact that my mother was speaking about the Holocaust, most often at San Francisco State University, where there was a class studying the Holocaust each year. And my mother would mention at the dinner table that she had gone again to speak to that group, or that she had received letters from the students telling about the impact of her presentation. So I had some awareness of this, but as a little kid, 8, 9, 10 years old, I'm not paying close attention. And when I'm old enough to pay attention, I'm doing that so common teenage thing of distancing myself from my parents and kind of intentionally not paying attention to what they're doing and just asking them to leave me alone in my room with my loud music playing, doing my homework, just leave me alone. So I learned very little, but I had some awareness that my mother was speaking. I also knew she was writing in English, this new language she had mastered. Within 12 years of her arrival in the US, the first of her stories was published in the San Francisco Chronicle. I have the May 21st edition of the Chronicle, so I have the actual print version of this story, which is the shortest of the stories that I compiled and used for her book. So I knew my mother was writing, but I just had no idea about the fine quality of her writing because I didn't read it till years later. We weren't talking about the Holocaust. Meanwhile, my mother is doing everything she can to just improve her writing skills, improve her speaking skills, master the language. I was unaware that she was taking classes at the community college. I was very aware, however, that each year in elementary school, the parents of my elementary school would have an annual talent show, and they would turn to my father and say, what will you do in the talent show? And my father would say, well, either I'm not going to be in it at all, or if you can use me as kind of an extra in somebody else's skit, give me a part with very few, if any, spoken lines, because my English is not that great. My mother, on the other hand, would say, just give me a time slot and I'll get up there by myself. I'll write a monologue. It'll be funny. And I'll do one this year and I'll write another one next year. And year after year, she would have these hilarious monologues, kind of like Zsa Zsa Gabor with her accent. I was so proud of her for doing this. And we all laughed, and it appears she was laughing. Later on, when I read the papers that I found after she had passed, I realized the extent to which she was really tormented through her life with guilt, depression, insomnia, nightmares. But she really did not want the world to see that. And so what the world saw was her infectious smile. She was fun-loving. She was a jokester. She became Northern California's foremost travel agent for travel to Israel. And she made numerous trips to Israel as a way of doing an ongoing search. Could she find any family members? If not brothers and sisters, could she find uncles or aunts? Or could she find documentation of what happened to her siblings, et cetera? Eventually, she was leading her own trips to Israel. So there's my mom's infectious smile that everybody saw. And on the other side of the picture, her dear friend Rena, who came over a few nights a week and they'd play Scrabble. Again, another way that my mother beefed up her vocabulary and her language skills. When I was a college student, I challenged Rena and my mom to a game of Scrabble. I came in third, even though English is my first language, and for my mom, probably her fourth language. She was really a master of the language. My mother passed away when I was 21 and a senior in college. This was taken shortly before she passed. When I got word that my mother had terminal lung cancer, that would have been the perfect time to say, Mom, before you die, I need you to talk to me about the Holocaust. But I felt like she was in so much pain from her cancer that I didn't want to bring up what I knew would be a painful subject. I figured when she dies, I'll talk to my father about it. Little did I know that right around the time she died, he would be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and I wouldn't be able to really communicate with him either. So I missed my chance, and I regret it. When she died and I was in graduate school, people said, you need to get home and take care of your father. And I wanted to finish graduate school, so I hired somebody to move in with my father and care for him. And then as soon as I finished graduate school, I moved in with him. And it became my job to go through the family's belongings and decide what are we going to keep and what are we going to get rid of. And I found my mother's stories. And some of them were typewritten. I call them her crafted stories because I found multiple drafts and I had to read them all to decide which one seems like the most recent, the most polished of her drafts. So they were crafted over time. And then I found this handwritten essay titled Follow Me into Auschwitz. And even it, in its crude form with words crossed out and other words written in, et cetera, it was such a polished piece of writing that I felt it also deserved to go into the book. So it serves as an introduction to the crafted stories. I also inherited recordings of my mother speaking at San Francisco State and on a TV show in San Francisco. And so I started to share everything that she had produced in school classrooms. And often I would hear from parents saying, what you shared yesterday in my son's English class or my daughter's history class was so impacting that my child came home and talked about it. Could I read the stories also? So I'd put them in the hands of parents, and parents, teachers, and students were all telling me the same thing, which was, you need to get these published. These are too strong, too impacting to just share them within the San Francisco Bay Area in a few schools. These need to find a wider audience. So that became a goal of mine about 30 years ago. And I felt like as the child of two Holocaust survivors, if I'm going to publish their stories, I should say something about the impact of the Holocaust on me as a second generation survivor. And I tried over the years to compose something, and everything I wrote just didn't measure up to my mother's writing, and I never felt comfortable enough with it to move forward. In 2014, I retired from the formal part of my teaching, the part where you're grading papers and evaluating students, and I started teaching at Ollie. And this afforded me some time to think about what else do I want to do with my life? And what I wanted to do with my life is publish my mother's stories at last. That was first on my list. So I hired a writing coach to help me. The writing coach took everything I had written over the years and read it. He gave me some writing prompts to get me writing again. And then he helped me sort out what's worth putting in the book and what isn't. And at that point, I felt ready to move forward. In honor of my parents, Felicia, whose nickname was Fela, and my father, Abram, I created Falabra Press. And that name was chosen to honor them. And Falabra Press has one publication, and it is this, Only Hope, A Survivor's Stories of the Holocaust. It is my mother's book. You see my contribution at the bottom. I wrote the foreword, I wrote the afterword, and I served as the book's editor, but that doesn't mean I needed to edit my mother's writing. My role as editor was to just decide how to organize a book. So here's the organizational scheme that I used. My foreword, the introductory essay, that handwritten essay that I have no idea how she intended to present that to the world, but I presented it before her crafted stories. The biographical timeline of her life, the first of her stories where her family is still together, but they're in a ghetto, and the package of hope arrives. It's a package sent by my mother's aunt, from Oakland, California, and to everyone's amazement, it makes its way to Poland and makes its way into the ghetto and makes its way to my mother's family. And they are in awe of the fact that this package has traveled all those miles. And it almost doesn't matter what's in it. It's just the package itself represents hope. And all the neighbors start stopping by because they also want to see the package and maybe partake of whatever's inside because they want to derive hope from it as well. My mother describes the transport from that ghetto to Auschwitz. 3 stories that take place in the concentration camp. Concert at Auschwitz is that story that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle. It documents something that happened on my mother's first day in Auschwitz when one of the most notorious, despised women guards in Auschwitz, Irma Gressa, who was later executed for her numerous crimes against humanity. My mother encounters Irma Gressa on her first day in Auschwitz when Irma Gressa demands that an opera singer in this group of women is hauled out of the group and is forced to sing for the group. And everybody's wondering, will this beautiful music being sung by this opera singer soften the heart of this guard who has asked for this concert, or will she go back to being just as ruthless as we've known her to be? The legacy is about 2 sisters who make a pact. We will either live through the Holocaust together or we will die together. And if one of us is going to be led to the gas chambers, the other will just tag along and we'll either live or die together. And this gets challenged at a certain point when someone threatens to separate them. And the story documents what happens in that moment. Choose Your Weapons is a story about 2 prisoners having a feud. One of them has absolutely no power, as you'd expect. The typical prisoner had no power, but one wielded tremendous power because he was designated as a capo, K-A-P-O, capo. A capo would be given special considerations, maybe extra food, maybe extra clothing, maybe an exemption from work, maybe a sort of get out of jail free card for his or her family members, or at least the family members would get lighter treatment as a result of the capo doing favors for a prison guard or a concentration camp guard. So a guard might say to his or her capo, here's a whip. Whip your fellow prisoners when they don't work fast enough. And if the capo says, I can't do that, some of these people I've known from childhood, and this includes my brother who's right there, I can't whip him. And the guard would say, well, then I'll find somebody else desperate enough to do it. And I won't give you the extra food or extra clothing. I'll find a capo one way or another. And so in this story, a capo is feuding with another prisoner, and the underdog is being beaten mercilessly every day. His teeth get kicked out, and yet everybody's wondering what is keeping him going. And we learn at the end of the story that he has had a scheme in the background, unbeknownst to the capo, something going on that is kind of fueling his spirit, fueling his energy. It's not a weapon with which you do bodily harm, but it's his way of fighting back. Years later, I learned that my parents had chosen their weapons, their way of fighting back, both of them doing their assigned slave labor in a sabotaged manner so that the things that they were forced to produce were not going to work properly when put to use. I'm so proud of them for taking that risk to do that. There's a story of the day of my mother's liberation when she wakes up at the Gross-Rosen concentration camp and finds that the guards aren't there anymore. They have fled. And now the prisoners that had been kept separate, the men separate from the women, the French prisoners separate from the Polish prisoners, separate from the Italian prisoners, now they can all get together. And a group of them go raid the kitchen, and they bring back food that has been just unseen to them in years. And so they're partaking of this food, and the French prisoners had been allowed to keep their musical instruments. So they're playing music, and those who are strong enough to dance are dancing, and others are just singing in multiple languages, songs to celebrate their liberation. And it's kind of a party atmosphere until a group says, we're going to go tour the grounds and see what else we can find. And what they find is a female guard that my mother knew very well, Matilda. And they bring Matilda back to the group and say, what should we do with her? And Matilda's begging for mercy, and the group has a choice to make about how merciful or unmerciful they will be. And my mother documents her difficult choice about, if this gets ugly, to what extent am I willing to participate in it? So it's a powerful story about that moment of decision about whether to seek revenge on somebody who's been merciless towards you. A story about the return to one's village, hoping that maybe you'll find other family members there, or maybe you'll find some new family living there. What will you find when you go back to your village? My afterword, and a few appendices, including a transcript from 1967 when my mother spoke at San Francisco State, the informative letter that gave me the information about how my parents had sabotaged their slave labor, a glossary for teachers using this in their classrooms, or parents sharing it with their children who come across words that they don't know, my acknowledgments, etc. Now, my mother never wrote about her the transport from ghetto to Auschwitz, but she did speak about it at San Francisco State. And so what I want to do is play you not the whole presentation, but excerpts from that presentation. And before I do that, let me stop sharing and just see if there are any questions. Can I get some assistance here from
Yes.
my chat monitor to tell me, what do we have in the way of chat questions?
Okay, so we have some questions. Oh, one is a simple one. If you could let people know how they could also take that online tour of Auschwitz.
I can, if anybody would go to onlyhopebook.com, use the contact link, and just send me a message. And you don't have to say, I'm trying to reach Irv, because Irv's going to be the one who gets your message 2 seconds after you hit send. So you can just say, I would like to know about the virtual tour of Auschwitz. I do know it's a Jewish community center that sponsors it, a Jewish community center in Arizona. I don't remember where in Arizona, but I'm happy to provide that information if somebody wants to contact me through onlyhopebook.com.
Great. Another question, was your mother's native language Polish, German, or Yiddish?
My mother spoke Polish and Yiddish probably equally well, and I really don't know which came first, Polish or Yiddish. I think eventually she also learned German, because my parents did live in a relocation camp in Germany for a while. My older brother was born in Germany. So I think that she was fluent in at least those 3 languages. And I'm going to embellish my answer a little bit and just mention that I met with my uncle, my father's brother, who lived into his 90s. My father died at age 60, but my uncle lived into his 90s. And I sat down with him with a tape recorder and said, I want to talk to you about my dad. And I mentioned to him that my dad just never seemed all that confident speaking to people, because he recognized his language skills weren't that strong. You would understand him if he spoke, but he would always yield to my mother and say, you speak on behalf of the family. And my uncle went, oh, what a shame. You never got to see your father in front of an audience speaking Polish. He was the bold one in the family. He had tremendous confidence. When we were growing up, he'd be the one who would organize something and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I need you to do this. I need you to do that. He was the organizer. He bossed people around. He had so much confidence. And I just went, oh my God, that wasn't the father I knew at all. So, and then my uncle said, you don't realize who the linguist in your family was. Your father spoke Yiddish, Polish, German, some Russian, some Hungarian, some Czech, some Hebrew. I mean, my dad was a linguist, and yet English was a language he had less confidence in. Okay, I'll zip my lip. Carol, next question.
Okay, great. This is just a note from Dale. Merritt College, that's where Huey Newton and Bobby Seale met around 1966.
It is
indeed. The
indeed.
Black Panther Party.
Yes, true. Which was very much an ongoing thing during my teenage years in Oakland, California. Yes.
Great. And then a bunch of folks sharing thanks, which I'll send to you after.
Okay.
Okay, this one's a little bit longer, so I'm going to read it more carefully. Okay, Irving Adanka, thank you. I just finished reading An Interrupted Life, The Diaries of Eddie Hilson. If you're familiar with that work, you'll know at a point she turns very much to God, and many pages are devoted to prayer. Did you find anything similar, benedictions, blessings, or poetry?
In my mother's writings, no. I did start that book, an uninterrupted An Interrupted Wife, The Diaries of Eddie Hillesum. I started that book and I don't know, something distracted me and I turned away from it. It's on my Kindle. I should return to it at some point. I've read many, many books about the Holocaust, but I don't recall my mother mentioning religion. She did maintain Jewish traditions throughout my teenage years, my childhood. But I sensed it was less about a belief in God. I think she questioned kind of, if there's a God, how did he let all this happen? He or she or it. But I think that my mother wanted to maintain the traditions that she grew up with. I think she wanted to continue the religion. And so it was important to her to impart religious tradition to her sons. At one point, my mother wrote that she was in awe of the people she would see in the concentration camps when every bite of food was so important that on Yom Kippur, the day on which an Orthodox Jew would fast, people around her were just turning down the food on that day. And she mentioned being in awe of that. In one of her presentations at San Francisco State during the question and answer, one of the students said, "Can you talk to us about your religion?" And my mother just said, "I'm a Jew, but I don't even know what kind of a Jew I am at this point." And I think it just forced her to question everything. But it meant enough to her to give me a Jewish upbringing.
Great, thank you. I think that's everybody. Oh, wait, hold on. Oh, just some thank you hands and shared. Okay, great. I think that's all the questions we have at this time. So you can keep
what I will do, and there will be other opportunities to ask questions. I really appreciate it. That you care enough to express your curiosities. I'm going to now share these excerpts of my mother speaking at San Francisco State. This will be about 9 minutes long, which will bring us to the halfway point of today's presentation. So at that point, we'll take a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, the second half of the presentation will be primarily me sharing excerpts from the book itself. So with no further ado, I'll begin this. It starts in about 5 seconds. You might have to adjust your volume. We'll see.
So now if you follow me, we'll go together to the station, to the collecting station. And there you're being counted. And a train drives up to the siding and you are marched up to the train, and it's a kettle train. And the doors are being locked from the outside and bolted, and the guards are mounting the platforms. And you are suddenly in a different world, in a train that's beginning to move, but has no windows, and it's full of people. And so you're surrounded by bodies, and you jostle against each other, and you fight for breath. And before you board the train, you're given a little loaf of bread, which kind of lulls your senses, because you feel, well, if you were going to death, why the hell would they give you bread? So you clutch that little piece of bread, and you don't know that it's going to have to last you for 3 days or whatever it will take them to get to your destination. And the destination is unknown. And there is a lot of speculation in the train going out as it moves through the countryside, and people are climbing on each other's shoulders to try to peek out and see where we're going, or where you are going, because you are with me now. And nobody can tell, but there's a lot of speculation, and there's always an optimist that would say, well, they're going to put us to work. We've worked before, and maybe we'll work another few months, and the whole thing will be over, and we'll go back and start a normal life again. And then it's always the pessimist that said, no, they're going to kill us all. Nobody wanted to believe that. How can anybody think anything that monstrous? And why would anybody want to kill us? That was the question. And so the train glides and rolls through the night, and you have to fight for your breath, you have to fight for space. There's no place to lie down, so you stand up. People that died overnight kind of are held up with the others, so there's a bit of room made in the corner for them. And finally you arrive at the destination, and this is the end of the line. And the train, it's early afternoon, and the doors of the train open, and you step out into a different world. It's unbelievable to you, because there is nothing to keep your mind to hang it on, no peg, nothing in the past that would connect with any scene like this. At first there is a reception committee, they tell you to step off, and there is a voice from a loudspeaker telling you that you've come to your destination, and this is a camp where you're going to work. And on the gates, there is a gate, an iron gate, and on the gate there is a legend which says, Arbeit macht frei, which translated into English means work sets you free. And it isn't until much later, after you've been there for a while, that you realize that the inscription should have said, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Well, you come down, and there's a reception committee consisting of guards with guns and bayonets, big German Shepherd and Doberman dogs. You're surrounded. From the distance, there is a band playing, and that makes it even more weird. You see a lot of wires, wire fences about 6 foot high, crisscrossing in every direction. And you're told to step out. You're told to leave all your belongings there. They will be delivered to you later. And you're also told that the older people and the children will have to go to a different part of the camp where they will be taken care of. And the young people will go to a work camp. And so you separate from your mother and your father, and you look at her, and she's trying to tell you something, and you don't quite know whether to leave her or not, but then you're pushed by the others, and everything is, the orders come then in such rapid succession, and everything is quick that you don't have time to think, so you leave with the others, the young people. You look out, and there are you see two big chimneys against the sky, tall chimneys with smoke and fire belching out of it day and night. And you begin to wonder, what is being burned there? Well, after all, you've been told that you're going to work, so perhaps this is a factory. And well, then, if it's factory, who's working there, and why don't they put us to work finally? They did put some people to work, and some people were just sitting there to wait, either to be, well, let's not jump ahead. We'll wait for, we don't know what. And somebody suggested that in this that fire that you see burning is because they burn our hair there. They burn your papers, your photographs, anything. But they don't burn your mother there. And you know that they do, but you don't want to believe it. You can't believe it, because if you do, then you go insane. So you try to fool yourself that it's not so. Death was very cheap at Auschwitz. It was so easy to die. It took no heroism. Death looked at you from the barrels of the guns. It looked at you from the eyes of the examining doctor. it you've looked at from the eyes of the people going to towards those chimneys in big vans. It was everywhere. It sunk you into your brain. But you couldn't accept that, otherwise you just can't function. And every hour lived at Auschwitz was a victory. The Nazis pretty nearly succeeded in bringing human beings to the level of animals. Pretty nearly. But there was that inner strength that you try to preserve, and you do tell yourself over and over again that it's they who are the animals and you are human. And there is that constant fight to preserve every bit of human feeling and not let them bring you down to the level. And when you're beaten, and you are beaten and kicked, you still think that it's he that's the animal. And you store things in your memory, and you say to each other, let's not ever forget any of it. Because if we do come out alive of this, if we do wake up from this insane nightmare, we have to bring the message to make sure that this thing will never happen again.
And what you see on the screen at the bottom, these are not my mother's words, but these are words I share anytime I'm in a middle school or high school classroom sharing this. I've told you this story not to weaken you, but to strengthen you. Now it is up to you, never again. And I try to get students to think about this pyramid of hate, as it's called. I asked them to think about the lower tiers of this pyramid. And I asked them, are you seeing some of this in your classroom? Are you seeing some of this in your school? It's likely you're seeing things at least at the bottom level where there are rumors being spread about people are being stereotyped, there are insensitive remarks being made towards people. And then, of course, it can escalate to the point where people are being ridiculed, or there's name calling going on, or bullying, or racial slurs, or cultural slurs. And if they're seeing this with their peers at whatever age they're at, it's likely that those people are going to, as they get older, escalate what they're doing, their hateful act, towards acts of discrimination, acts of bias-motivated violence, and ultimately this is how genocide happens, that people just sort of allow things to escalate from each of these tiers to the next. So I asked them to think about, if you're seeing some of the things at the bottom portion of this, what are you going to do about it? Can you call it to the attention of people who can put a stop to it? Can you work with other students to create more of an inclusive atmosphere? Is it meaningful enough for you to do it? Or are you just willing to be passive and say, well, it's not me, so it's not my problem? I urge you to get involved, because it was people's passivity that allowed the Holocaust to happen. Many people were aware of what was going on and just said, it's not my problem. And so I ask students to think about this. And when we look at the bottom level there and see stereotyping, I admit to the students of my own guilt about stereotyping, that for years throughout my adult life, people would ask me, do you want to go to Germany? When you go to Europe, are you going to go to Germany? And I'd always say, no, I don't want to go there. Not after what happened to my parents. And then I met somebody who said, Irv, you owe it to yourself to come to Germany and see that the Germany of today is not the Germany of the past. And so I finally did go to Germany, and I was so bowled away by what I saw there in terms of the efforts the government have made to see to it that everybody is aware there was a Holocaust and we mustn't let it happen again. In the center of Berlin, there is this huge memorial titled The Memorial to the Lost Jews of Europe. And it's very stark. It looks like coffins. And some of the coffins are small, some of the coffins are large. They're not actually coffins, but they look like coffins. And this is in very, very centrally located in Berlin. That dome in the background, that's the Reichstag. That's the main government building for the whole nation. And this is very near the Brandenburg Gate. They want this memorial to be a reminder of what happened. And so for me, I had to admit that I was guilty of stereotyping. And I think we all at some times are guilty of stereotyping. And if we can catch ourselves and try to put a stop to our own stereotyping, we have a chance of making a difference. So with that, I will stop sharing, and I would suggest we take a 5-minute break. By the time I stop talking, it'll be 5 minutes past the hour, and then we'll reconvene at 10 minutes past the hour. I'm just going to stay put, so if anybody has a question they want to ask, I'll keep monitoring the chat and see if I can respond to any other questions during this break, but I'll see you all in 5 minutes. If you want to step away from your computers, that's fine. Sandy, if Sandy's listening, I appreciate the comment. Your mother was so articulate. Yes, she was. And even more so in her written words than her spoken words, because in her spoken language, she tends to get tongue-tied sometimes, and sometimes the verb and the noun are different tenses or whatever. And with her written language, she really had a chance to go back and proofread and fix all those little inaccuracies. To the people who are expressing their thanks, I thank you. Thank you for your openness to learn about the Holocaust and try to get an understanding of what people went through.
Irving, when we come back, I think, do you want to, I can help you with some of the questions that are a little farther
Okay,
up.
I'm scrolling through them right now, so I'm aware of the fact that there are some questions, and I'll just do my best to kind of do it myself, and then Carol, if you see I've overlooked something, please point it out, okay?
Sounds great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, everybody, we have about 20 more seconds, and then we will begin again. Okay. So let me try to respond to a few of the questions here. I noticed that somebody posted a link to a virtual tour, and then I responded, no, that's not the one. I think the one that Nan Bookless posted at 12:48 p.m. They're all timed when I look at the chat. At 12:48 p.m., Nan posted one that I think is the one that I participated in. It's sponsored, I believe, by the East Valley Jewish Community Center in Arizona, and I'm pretty sure that that matches the URL that I used to get on the tour. Very informative, and it's done several times a year. And if one of them is sold out, get on a future one. It's a great tour. Dale mentions this is unbelievably eloquent, powerful writing. I see why there was very little need for editing. My mother's written words are even more polished than her spoken words. When she speaks, she tends to make a few mistakes here and there, but when she has a chance to proofread her writing, she really dots every I, crosses every T, and just makes sure that everything's right. Let's see, other comments that I want to share with the group. Somebody mentions having taken a 6-session course that I did for the National OLLI. And so I was teaching to several OLLI programs simultaneously as part of a pilot program. And in that course, I mentioned somebody named Rudolf Verba. Rudolf with an F at the end, Rudolf, VRBA. Is his last name, Rudolf Verba. And so I want to recommend that if you don't know anything about Rudolf Verba, or even if you do, that you look him up on the internet, try to find, there are YouTube videos where he is speaking. There are various people who have written articles about Rudolf Verba. He is one of the few people who escaped from Auschwitz, made his way to Slovakia, and told the world about what was going on at Auschwitz, a story that the world could not believe, did not want to believe. And he knew so many little details that he could cite, sort of like with a photographic memory, that people realized, wow, he's got this down to an amazing amount of detail. He must know what's going on there. And he basically changed the world's attitudes about what was going on at Auschwitz when he made people aware. So that's Rudolf Verba. I want to suggest everybody learn about him. Somebody asked about me carrying on my parents' legacy. Do I have children? And if so, where are they with this subject? I have no biological children of my own, nor does my wife, but through a previous relationship of hers, she has 2 stepdaughters. One of those stepdaughters has 2 children. Those 2 children call me grandpa, call my wife grandma, and my grandson, who is a college student, he has read the book and he's commented, and we've talked about it. My granddaughter is in high school, and to my knowledge, she has not read it. Her mother, my stepdaughter, has read it. So that's the extent of me sharing it with my family. I've shared it in many school classrooms, as I've said. So having taught younger learners, I did 9 years at the university level, but 31 years with younger learners. A lot of those kids, I consider them my kids. I spent a whole year or more with them, and I've shared the story with many of them, and many of them have asked if they can see this presentation, and I send them the link and they tune into one of my presentations. So that's my comment about that one. Somebody asked, can I comment on the current anti-Semitism in the US? It's a very, very sad state of affairs to see the extent to which anti-Semitism is on the rise here and elsewhere. And not just anti-Semitism, there's anti-Asian, Pacific Island hate. And I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and a lot of my high school peers were Asian, and I'm hearing about things that their older family members are suffering as a result of people, using hate speech towards them, in some cases violent actions towards Asians. So as my mother wrote in one of her stories, there was that story where they find a prison guard and they bring her back, and the group has to decide what to do with her. And my mother uses a line that goes something like, hating is so easy, and hating with a group has a special appeal. And what happens is these hate groups draw in other people saying, join us, because it's easier to hate as a group than to just hate individually. And we'll find our scapegoats and we'll direct our hate towards them. So it breaks my heart to see the extent to which that's on the rise. Only once have I had a Holocaust denier in my audience, and that was here where I live in Ashland, Oregon, in a live presentation at the library. And he challenged me at the end of my presentation. He stood up and said, I have a question, and that is, why do you waste people's time talking about a Holocaust that never really happened? And I looked right at him and I said, you've made a decision to ignore a tremendous amount of evidence. And just like you, I have to decide what I'm going to ignore. And I turned away from him and said, does anybody else have a question? Because I knew there was no point in arguing with him. I wasn't going to convince him, and I just needed to get on with my presentation. And if he chooses to ignore the facts, if he's ignored them till now, he's going to continue to ignore them, and nothing I say is going to change his mind. But I just feel good about sharing this with as many people as I can, in as many school classrooms as I can, and just help people to understand what really happened. I'm absolutely delighted at the number of young people who have contacted me saying they've read my mother's book and gotten something out of it. Somebody asked me if I would please put up the slide with the bias to genocide again. Instead of doing that, I'm going to just tell you where I found it. If you go to Google Images and just type in pyramid of hate, you will see a bunch of different pyramids of hate, each looking slightly different from the others. The one that I chose, I copied and pasted it from the Anti-Defamation League's website. So if you do a Google search for pyramid of hate, you'll find the pyramid that I used, plus other slightly different formulations of the same thing. I remember there was one other comment that I wanted to make. Somebody says, as a college educator, this is a particularly appropriate question for me. There was a recent mention in the Atlantic that 2/3 of millennials and Gen Xers did not know that 6 million Jews died during the Holocaust. Does this sound correct? By all means, it does. If you ask people of that generation, can you name a single concentration camp? Many cannot. Many do not know what the word Holocaust means. Somebody asked me to put the name Rudolf Verba in the chat, so I will do that. Rudolf with an F at the end, V-R-B-A. Okay, so I just posted that. Let me see here. I think I may have responded. Oh, somebody asked about Holocaust education being mandatory in certain states. When I'm presenting in a high school or middle school classroom and I show that pyramid of hate and I say, do what you can to make a difference. And some students will say, well, what can I do to make a difference? I'm just one person. And I tell them about one person here in Oregon who made a difference. That person is Claire Sarnofsky. Now, Sarnofsky may sound like a Jewish last name, but it's not. Claire was a high school student in Lake Oswego, Oregon, who had a Holocaust survivor visit her elementary school classroom, I think when she was in 5th grade. And then she had some follow-up questions she wanted to ask that Holocaust survivor. So she got the email address from her teacher and emailed this person and sort of became a pen pal with him until he died. When she reached high school, she realized, if I didn't meet this Holocaust survivor back in 5th grade, I would know nothing about the Holocaust because nobody has given me any information during my schooling about the Holocaust. Everybody should be learning about this. My fellow high schoolers should be learning about the should be learning about the Holocaust, excuse me. And so with the encouragement of her parents and her teacher, she contacted her state senator. She's not old enough to vote, but she contacted her representative in the state Senate and said, you should put forward a bill to mandate Holocaust education in the schools. And that bill passed. It was nicknamed Clare's Law. While Claire was still in high school, the bill was named Clare's Law. The governor signed it at a ceremony that Claire attended. I learned about this. I contacted Claire's father and said, would it be okay for me to communicate with your daughter? I'd like to send her a copy of my mother's book, inscribed for the fine work that she has done. And ever since, Claire and I have been in contact with each other. About every 3 months or so, one of us will send an email to the other. Claire is now pre-med at some school. I think they're in Massachusetts. So I'm delighted with her work that she's done in the world regarding Holocaust education. Somebody's asked, how are people asking me these questions? They're putting them in the chat. Have I gone through all the questions? I think so. If not, I'll come back to, somebody said, have I read Life in a Jar? No, I've not, but I will make note of it. I have heard the name Irene Sendler. This person has mentioned that it's been turned into a play. People have been talking to me about, Irv, you should turn your mom's stories into a play. And so I'm kind of mulling that over and asking myself, who could I work with to make that happen? Right now, the book exists only in paperback form, available through the book's website, onlyhopebook.com, or from Amazon as a paperback, also from Amazon as a Kindle book. Another thing percolating in my mind is turning it into an audio book, but that has not happened yet. Somebody has asked, is the Holocaust being stripped from the school curriculum around the country as they are with enslaved persons? I don't know. I do wonder about that. We do see a lot of efforts made to be very controlling about what our students learn about the darkest parts of our own history here in the US. And I don't know to what extent that is causing people to want to also cover up dark periods of European history. I just know that in Germany, they're not letting that happen. They are teaching their students about the Holocaust. So what I want to do now is I'm going to just stop looking at the chat because I just need to return to the book, at least for now. And I want to share a few excerpts from the book for you. First, I want to tell you a little bit about my foreword. My foreword it serves as an introduction in much the same way that I introduced the presentation today with my PowerPoint slides. And it begins with these few sentences. My mother wrote, my father spit. My mother talked, my father spit. My mother told her stories to anyone who would listen, my father spit. My mother wanted to share her Holocaust experiences with you, and she did so by writing the stories that you hold in your hand. My father kept his own experiences locked up tight within himself, and then he spit. Now, it may sound from what you just heard that my father just was a spitter and that he spit all the time. I saw my father spit only once in his life, but it was so impacting to see that happen that it became the theme for the beginning of my foreword. It was not until my father had Alzheimer's disease and I was trying to care for him at home, and someone had given him a bag of European stamps from the 30s and 40s. And he was not a stamp collector, but he was amusing himself just by looking at stamps. He set it down, look at the next stamp, set it down. And I'm grading paper sitting next to him. And at one point I see my father get really agitated, and then he spits on that stamp. And in that moment, it was as if the floodgates opened and he let out his anger, his frustration, his grief, and he spit on that stamp that had Hitler's picture on it. And, you know, it told me my father has so many stories that he's never told and he never will tell, but he's at least letting out some of that anger that he's held on to for his whole life. Moving on to a later part of my foreword, I'll read you a few paragraphs. As I think about my parents' experiences in the Nazi concentration camps, I wonder what kept them going. With too little food, death all around them, savage beatings doled out to those not doing their assigned slave labor quickly enough, and the loss of all that had once been dear to them, I wonder what could they do to summon the will to live another day? The only answer that comes to me is they could hope. With shattered dreams, interrupted educations, no homes or family to which they might someday return, and a horrifying day-to-day existence, they could not make plans for their futures. They could only hope. Would each day's meager food ration provide enough sustenance to stay alive until tomorrow? Would the doctor making the selections of who should live and who should die allow them another day's salvation? If yesterday they were lucky to avoid being singled out by a capricious and malicious guard, would that luck last through another day? They could only hope. Would the torn rags that had to suffice as clothing provide enough warmth at night to avoid freezing to death? Would the diseases that ran rampant throughout the camps, taking many lives, spare theirs? They could only hope. My mother, Felicia Lubliner, died in 1974, but she lives on in the pages you are about to read. She also lives on in the hearts and minds of the many people who have read and been impacted by her stories. You are about to enter her world, and I am confident you will be grateful that you decided to go there. And then the rest of my foreword is an introduction to who was Felicia Bornstein Lubliner. Why am I the publisher of her stories? What was her life about? Moving on to that handwritten essay that I showed you earlier, Follow Me into Auschwitz. I'm going to read you the last several paragraphs of it. And people often comment about my mother's use of the second person, you. She doesn't want us, and I'm in a chair with wheels, so I can actually sort of act this out. She does not want us to distance ourselves from the Holocaust. Instead, she wants us to lean into it. She wants us to say, I'm willing to come along with you. Take me into Auschwitz. Show me what you experienced there. Let me experience it. I know it will come to an end. I know it's just a tour, but allow me to experience what you experienced and meet the people that you met. So thus the title, Follow Me into Auschwitz. What would you have done if it were your freedom and your life that were being threatened by the Nazis? What if it were your parents, your children, your brothers and sisters, and your dearest friends that were being taken away, never to be seen again? Would you have fought the Nazis with your bare hands? Would you have chosen to die by your own hand rather than let yourself be driven to the gas chambers? Accusations have been made that Jews behaved cowardly and let themselves be slaughtered by the millions without resistance. This is not true. There was resistance, not only desperate, armed, and heroic, as in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, but day-by-day resistance and a will to withstand, to outlive. Death was cheap at Auschwitz. It was ever present, stinking its way into your very brain, blackening the sky with its smoke, looking at you from the barrels of guns and from the eyes of the condemned. Death was with you during the dreaded roll calls, where at dawn and dusk you stood for endless hours in ankle-deep mud, with only rags between you and the biting chill of the wind. It was easy to die at Auschwitz. One did not have to be a hero to die. There were many ways you could have saved the SS the work. All you had to do was give up. Give up willingly the spark of life still flickering in you, that last thing you had, which they were so determined to take. You could have risked your own life and tried to attack an SS guard, as has been suggested by Dr. Bruno Bettelheim in his book, The Informed Heart. This, even if it were possible, would have been not only a foolish way to commit suicide, but it would have been murder as well. For by your so-called heroism, you would have exposed your next of kin, your loved ones, and the rest of your fellow inmates to the uncontrollable fury of SS revenge. It was easier to just touch the electrified wires crisscrossing the campsite and end it all. The temptation was always there. It was hardest to resist at night. The wires stretched as far as you could see, with the lights strung on them and the wind playing a weird invitation to death. Touch me, come close, touch me. It took great strength to resist, but we resisted. I resisted the temptation. Dying makes sense if one has a cause to die for. We had no such cause. We had a great cause to live. By my own death, I could not possibly have saved anybody nor accomplished anything. It would have been a futile gesture and an easy way out, and it would have proved that deep in my heart, I believed that Auschwitz is forever. It would have meant admitting to myself that this screaming, insane world around me represented the universe. I chose to live. For every hour lived at Auschwitz was a victory, and if I had lost in the end, I would be marching to meet death along with the others, without tears, without dramatic outbursts, but in a silence that shrieked its mute protest into the unheeding heavens and a deaf world. The world was not prepared for Auschwitz. It was, in fact, a place unbelievable even for its inmates. No words can really adequately describe this weird world, unlike anything mankind had ever known. In order to understand its implication, you actually had to be part of it. I'll have to be autobiographical, but follow me, if you will, into Auschwitz and spend a day there and meet some of the people in the nameless mass of bodies. Try, if you will, to feel, even for a moment, that you could have been one of them, that in fact you were one of them. Let me stop for a moment here. I'm so pleased with the curiosity being expressed, the resources being mentioned. I want to mention, in response to a number of you putting in the chat, and I'll save the chat later so I can reference these. A number of you have made recommendations of books that you've read, and I keep a resource list of books and movies that are Holocaust related with little stars next to the ones that I've seen or read myself and others that have been recommended by people like you. If any of you would like to get my resource list, I invite you to send me a message. Again, using the contact link at onlyhopebook.com. You can contact me about that or anything else. But I would be happy to share this resource list with you. Are there, Carol, do we have any other chat questions that I should be responding to?
I think it's less, there's not too many questions.
I do see one about the name Felicia, saying that she has an aunt named Felicia. Is it a Polish name or a derivative from the Polish language? I don't really know. I know that there are various spellings in Polish, some of which have a silent J in it, Felicia, with a kind of a J towards the end. But whether it's a common Polish name or if the English name comes from Polish, I really have no idea. Somebody says I need to publish an audiobook and I should be the narrator. That's the question I've asked many groups. Who should narrate the book? Should it be a female voice or my voice? So Jerome has said it should be my voice. Thank you for that comment, Jerome.
There was a question a little bit farther up about, with Florida's work, changing
Right.
curriculum and all that kind of stuff. This person wrote that they were fearful that DeSantis would do that with the Holocaust as well. Do you have thoughts on that?
I don't know if Florida has a huge Jewish population who might be outraged at this, but then again, there are people expressing outrage about things that are still happening there, and they're happening in spite of that outrage. So I just don't know, but it does concern me that just like the dark parts of our history are being covered up in some cases, that the darkest parts of the world history, in particular the Holocaust, could also be covered up. So I really don't know the answer to that one. So let me go back to sharing. I'll come back to questions later. I wasn't sure how many questions there would be, and thus I wasn't sure if I'd have time to read this story, but I'm going to be reading quickly. And I'm going to share one element of the book in its entirety. That is the story that was published in the San Francisco Chronicle 1961. This is within 12 years of my mother's arrival, not knowing this language. And she writes what you're about to hear. There is one German word you will hear, and that word is Lieder. The singular is Lied, the plural Lieder. Lieder were German songs associated with the Romantic period, kind of like folk songs. German folk songs associated with the Romantic period were Lieder. So when you hear that word, you'll know what it refers to. This is concert at Auschwitz. I was sent to Auschwitz late in 1944 when the war in Europe was already 5 years old. For us, the Jewish people in Poland, those were long, terror-filled years when I learned the paralyzing effect of fear, when my healthy young appetite was replaced by hunger that kept me awake at night, gnawing inside like a worm, and when the only defense against humiliation was our contempt for the tormentors. I was already then a veteran of 2 ghettos and had lost trace of my father and 2 sisters who were sent away and never heard from again. I thought I had seen and lived through the worst. Then I came to Auschwitz. I remember every day and everything that occurred, but some things, fragments, pictures, stand out more sharply in focus. One of them is this unbelievable picture of my first day in Auschwitz. There I was, dressed in pitiful rags, thrown to me at random after my clothes had been taken away, barefoot with no undergarments. My freshly shaven head was naked and shamefully exposed. I was sobbing in despair. I was separated from my mother when we came off the train. I did not know then what was happening to her, that she was being led to the gas chambers to die. I longed to be with her. She looked so forlorn and frightened as we were forced apart. Cry, cry, little one, whispered someone in my ear. It is good for you. I too cried when I first came here. We all did, but we have no more tears left. Look around, see for yourself. I raised my head and looked at what seemed to be only a blur of faces and a multitude of people surrounding me, all packed so close together there was no room to move about. It was quiet, except for an occasional moan, sigh, cough, or whisper. How long have you been here? I asked my new friend. I don't know exactly, she answered. It has been such a long time. Maybe a month. We lose all track of time here. We just wait. Wait for what? I asked. Wait to be free. We will be free someday. We must believe this, she said, or else. She did not finish her sentence, for suddenly a large door was thrown wide open, and a burst of bright daylight almost blinded me. There was considerable commotion and orders shouted. My heart stood still with fear. When I dared to look up again, a few women were standing in the doorway, listening attentively to orders being given by the head of the group. This leader was a young woman in an SS uniform with a culotte skirt and riding boots. In one of her white-gloved hands, she carried a riding crop. The other rested on her hip, where she wore a holster and a pistol. My friend whispered to me, she is Irma Gressa. We call her the angel of death. Don't move now. Don't let her notice you or single you out. As it turned out this particular morning, Irma Gressa was in a mood to be entertained and wanted music. She had heard that among this group was a former star of the Warsaw Opera and wanted to hear her sing. A young woman was ordered out of the crowds of inmates. She still showed traces of beauty on her emaciated face, in spite of her shaven head. Her naked body could be seen through the holes of her tattered garment. As she began to sing, Irma Gressa stood quietly, listening to the beautiful arias, lieder, and folk songs, which poured forth in an uninterrupted stream. The young woman sang of love, beauty, and peaceful nature, while outside, the smokestacks of the crematoria billowed clouds of fire and smoke, which covered the sky for miles. When I looked about me, I saw the effect of the beautiful music on my fellow inmates. They were motionless, but tears were streaming down their faces. I was amazed to see that they did have tears left, the memories of long forgotten days of happiness breaking through the despair of hopelessness. There was no applause. After the concert ended, Irma Gressa walked away quietly. On the way back to her quarters, she calmly shot a girl for raiding the garbage can in search of potato peelings. And that's Concert at Auschwitz. My mother expresses, and so many authors have expressed, just how easy it was to lose your life in a concentration camp. You might die of starvation, you might die of disease, you might die because you're in the wrong place at the wrong time and a guard doesn't like what you're doing. You might die because somebody else did something wrong and the guard decides, I'm going to punish you and 50 others. And so these group punishments were such that you just never knew when your time was up. And you never knew when you went through these daily selections and you're sent to the left or the right, you don't really know whether your group is going where. You might go, well, I look like I'm in the healthy group. Well, the healthy group might be the group that they're sending to a different camp entirely. It might be that group is going to stay in Auschwitz another day while the other group is put to death. You just never knew where you wanted to be at any given time. And my mother describes the last selection she ever went through in Auschwitz before she was sent to this other camp, Gross-Rosen. She was still with two of her sisters. And her sisters were sent to one line and she was sent to the other. And so she tried to sneak out of her line to be with her sisters. And as she describes it, she didn't care whether her sisters were going to live or die at that point. If they were going to die, she wanted to die. If they were going to live, she wanted to live. It was more important to her that she be with her sisters than that she live or die at that moment. She was brutally dragged back and kicked back to her other line when they caught her. And she ended up being sent out of that camp and never saw her sisters again. But everything was just so mysterious in terms of where do I want to be? Who do I want to be around? How do I avoid staying out of trouble? How do I avoid getting anybody's attention so that tomorrow I'll wake up alive? It just amazes me. I noticed that in the chat, somebody said, can I share this presentation with others? I don't know what the protocol is for within your OLLI, but I do know, regardless of whether it's appropriate to share this with your OLLI members, there is a presentation that I did for the OLLI at Eckerd College in Florida. Because it was a webinar and I was the only person on camera, they said, Irv, if you want to put this on your website, feel free to. So on onlyhopebook.com, there is a 90-minute version of this presentation that you could see and share with others. There are various interviews, other shorter presentations and such, so feel free to look at onlyhopebook.com. Somebody asked if there are other recordings of my mother that could be played in their entirety. I invite anybody with such an interest to contact me, and I can I can provide you with a link to hear other the full recordings of my mother's presentations. I would just ask that they're not distributed because eventually they may end up in an audio book. Carol, are there other questions you've noticed that I should respond to? I don't think I've ever spoken to such a responsive group in terms of people having questions and things to share. It's just great.
That's lovely. Yeah, and so we will have the recording up on our YouTube page tomorrow, and we'll share the link out with everybody who registered, assuming that there's some folks who couldn't get in because they didn't have power or internet today.
Okay.
And we can either, Irving, we can either do that as listed or unlisted. Like, are you comfortable with it being public?
Yes, and I'm
Okay,
comfortable for it staying up for forever.
Great. Okay, so yeah, so then that way folks can just share it out with anybody they want to, and
great.
We'll be good to go.
Okay, so I'm going to progress through the book. I'm skipping over a number of stories that are in the book, all of them powerful in my opinion. Can you tell I'm proud of my mother? I hope that comes through. I want to skip to my afterword and tell you a little bit about it. Whenever I'm in a school classroom, I always keep an eye on the clock. And when there's about 2 minutes left, I tell the students, okay, everything I've shared with you has tremendous relevance and importance to my family experience. And I hope you found it interesting. But let's turn our focus to your family and the experiences of your family members. Who are the elders in your family and how much do you know about them? How much do you know about your grandparents? If they're still alive, have you ever spoken to them about their childhoods? If you're lucky enough to have a father and or a mother in your household, how much do you know about their lives before you were born? You might know what mom or dad does as a career, but is that what he or she wanted to do as a career when they were your age? Life has a way of throwing curveballs at us. And sometimes those curveballs are an inconvenience. Sometimes we're called upon to care for a family member who needs care. So instead of doing that, we go care for that person. And when we're finished with that, maybe an opportunity is no longer available to us. So we have to shift gears and do something different. Sometimes we shift gears because we want to. Sometimes it's something piques our curiosity and say, oh, I think I'm going to major in that instead of this. And that's going to lead me down this career path instead of that one. How much do you know about your parents' experience? I don't want you to have the same experience that I had where I waited too long to ask. So have those conversations with your parents, your uncles, your aunts, your grandparents, your teachers, all the elders in your life. And with that sentiment that I've expressed in so many classrooms, I composed a foreword that is broken into 3 parts. The first part is prefaced with the 4 words, don't ask, don't tell. And that was kind of like the unwritten rule in my household. I wouldn't ask many questions. My parents wouldn't give me many answers. The next part is prefaced with the words, do ask, do tell. And it's my encouraging people to have intergenerational conversations. And then the last part is just a personal expression of what it means to me to have finally published my mother's book after so many years of wanting to do so. And I'm going to read you the last few paragraphs of my afterword. A few weeks before she died, my mother recorded some of her innermost thoughts on a cassette tape, most of which were about her fears of death. I recently played that recording and heard her say to me, and at this point, she was so close to dying that it was just a whisper as she recorded this on a cassette tape. I'm afraid of nothingness. I'm afraid of not being. Not being. What am I going to leave behind? How long will I be remembered? How long? For as long as one is remembered, one is not dead. I believe that. You can live in people's minds, memories, and hearts. I believe that. As I heard those words, I was reminded of a letter that I received from a high school student with whom I had shared my mother's writing. This student wrote, "Keep doing what you're doing. When you share her stories, you will not only be honoring your mother, but you will change so many different lives. By guiding her writing into your hands, I have faith that my mother will live on in your mind, your memory, and your heart as she does in mine. May this book serve as a fitting tribute to her indomitable spirit and resilience. That is my only hope. I miss you, Mom." So let me mention that occasionally I get validation about that message about intergenerational conversations from students. I've spoken at our local high school each of the last 10 years or so. And sometimes I'll be downtown and a student will come up to me and just say, "I recognize you from last year. You came to my English class and you shared your mom's stories. Thanks for doing that. And by the way, you encouraged us to have conversations with our grandparents. I did that. Thanks for making the suggestion. It was really good to sit down and talk to them." And sometimes I have teachers tell their students, write to Professor Lubliner and thank him. He'd love to hear what was your favorite of the stories he shared. And the story they most often share is that one called Choose Your Weapons, because they like rooting for the underdog who's being tormented by this capo. And then we learned that he's been fighting back all along and he's had a scheme going. So that's so often mentioned as their favorite of the stories. But sometimes they will say to me, thank you for speaking to our class. Here was my favorite story. And by the way, I want you to know, I heard your message loud and clear about that I should talk to my parents, talk to my grandparents, and I did so. So it's just so gratifying to me anytime I know that that message is actually hit home and that a student has acted on that suggestion that I have made. For a while, I was serving on the board of directors for the OLLI here at Southern Oregon University, and I became the leader of a task force to try to generate more interaction between the college students and the OLLI members. And that's an ongoing effort. And I'm not on the board anymore, but I know there's somebody still working to make that happen. And they know that I'm ready to volunteer anytime I can. I'm going to end this presentation by again playing you my mother's voice, recorded in 1967. And also let me mention, I just saw this come up on the chat. Somebody said, she put it in her name and she said, please send me the list of books. I'm happy to send it, but I will need people to go to the book's website, onlyhopebook.com. Check out all the resources there. If you wish to purchase a book, you can do so, either from me or from Amazon. If you purchase it directly from Falabra Press, I will sign a copy, I will date it. If you ask me to, I'll inscribe it, and I'll be the one sending you the book. Obviously, you won't get a signed copy if you purchase from Amazon. But if you don't wish to purchase a book, that's fine. You can still contact me through onlyhopebook.com. And there is where I would like you to channel any such requests for me to send you something. So now what I wish to do is share my screen one last time and share with you the last several minutes of my mother speaking at San Francisco State in 1967. It's an old recording. The quality is not very good. So I'm going to begin reading you my mother's words as they are transcribed in the book. And then at a certain point, I will silence myself and let my mother's voice take over. How would you feel in this unreal world? Could you imagine? It is not really real. It doesn't happen. It couldn't be happening. You sometimes think it's a different planet, that it isn't really you that's there. And then there is a final selection. You never know which way to run because one selection will take away the young people and one selection will take away the middle-aged people. The one will take away the ones that look, still have a little flesh on your bones. The other selection will come and take the real skeleton-like people. So you don't know who they're going to pick and in which group to find shelter. So you rub a little brick dust into your cheeks to look healthier. Perhaps you'll pass. And I'll just mention here that my mother, in one of her stories, she refers to brick dust as the rouge of Auschwitz, because people would put it on their skin to try to give themselves a healthy, rosy look. So the hope is you rub a little brick dust into your cheeks to look healthier, perhaps you'll pass. There will be another day. And by tomorrow, the war might be over. You march in front of the doctor. The band is playing. He is whistling a tune. You pass in front of him. He looks at you. You're naked, of course. With a wave of his hand, he decides your fate. Rechts, links, right, left. Not until the vans come and take away a group do you really know which group is going where and where you're going to go. Then we watch the vans going away, packed with bodies, and you see eyes, hundreds of eyes looking at you silently moving away. What is the message? You see people from the vans taking off their shoes, that's if they manage to have any, to throw them back to the ones that were left. They won't be needing them anymore. And then you fight for those shoes to get them if you're left.
So it's a struggle.
But if you had preserved one spark of your identity, of what you were, of wanted to be, you have won. Dead or alive, you have won. And then if you're lucky, although at that time you don't think you're lucky, you don't know it, you survive the war, you find yourself alone, friendless, with no home, nothing to go back to. And again, you dare not yet think of future, so you think of the past. Now you think of the immediate past, you're filled with bitterness, you're filled with hate for everything, to the world that allowed this to happen. You hate yourself for having stayed alive while the others are dead. You think of the things you might have done, perhaps. Could you have put a little more of the brick dust on your little sister? Perhaps it would help her. Perhaps she too would pass this election. You think of these things. You think of revenge. You think a lot of revenge. And you also think of filling your belly, of having enough to eat, of having clothes, and a toothbrush. And you have to make choices again. Are you going to go through your life without having learned anything? Are you going to turn out to be a bitter, hateful person? Or are you going to turn your mind and try to see the world and yourself objectively and try to act and build a life that you think might be of some credit to you? You also think it might be of some credit to those that want you to watch it. You learn, most of all, that human spirit is unconquerable. And if you had learned that, you somehow feel that perhaps you staying alive was worth all this. Thank you.
And with that, my mother thanked her audience. And for all of the presentations I've given up until this week, this has been the end of the presentation, and I've thanked my audience. But I'm going to stretch this for about 1 more minute, because I want to share one more thing with you. I mentioned to you earlier that my mother appears in an Academy Award-winning documentary called The Long Way Home, and her appearance lasts all of about 2 seconds. But just as inheriting my mother's writings and being able to share them is very precious to me, having her recorded voice is precious, having those 2 seconds of movie footage is precious, and I'd like to share them with you now. This is 2 seconds from The Long Way Home. I hope you'll keep my mother in your heart and your thoughts, and that this was time well spent for you. I feel so fortunate to be able to present to you my mother, and what she wanted to share with all of us. So thank you, everybody. A special thank you to the organizers, Carol, Judith, and Ray. I thank you, everybody. And I would love to hear from you. onlyhopebook.com is the contact link. If there's any other questions, I'll stay on and take them. Your Ollie, I think, gets the prize for the most information being shared and the most curiosity expressed, and that's just wonderful. So if Carol, there are other members who perhaps had power failure today and feel that a recorded thing is not quite enough and you'd like me to do this again at some point in the future, you won't require a lot of arm twisting. I've had colleagues for whom I've done it a second or even a third time. So I would very much like to be kept in mind for future presentations. And again, I thank everybody so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Irving. And we wish you all the best in your continued work sharing this such important story and the beautiful words of your mom. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right.
All right.
Bye.
Take care, everybody. Be safe and be well.